Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live today, where we are going to be talking about from boomers to Zoomers and communicating effectively in a multi-generational workforce. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Mary Donahue, who is the CEO of the Digital Wellness Center. Dr. Donahue is recognized as North America's leading proactive mental health and digital psychology expert, and she's reframed wellness as a communication tool. Dr. Mary Donahue is also the author of Message Received, 7 Steps to Break Down Communication Barriers at Work, and her new book, Digital Addiction, What Is It and How One Sister and Brother Dealt with It, can be pre-ordered soon on Amazon. Dr. Mary Donahue, thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited about our conversation.
Well, my friend, I am so grateful to be here, and please, it's Mary.
Oh, thank you. We want to get right into it. Those who are joining live, please be sure to post your questions. We are going to be moderating the chat. I've got a few questions for Mary today, and then I'm going to go into the chat and we're going to pull out some of your questions to make it as interactive as possible. So let's get right into it, Mary. You know, we just ran a survey on ageism in the workplace, and one of the questions that we asked our respondents is whether or not they work in a multi-generational workforce. Now, only 6% of our respondents said that they didn't. So majority of us work in a multi-generational workforce. So my first question to you is, can you share some examples of how different generations tend to communicate differently at work?
I absolutely can. I've prepared a chart. And before we go to the chart, I always like to use 3 different forms of learning: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, because that's really what drives this differentiation in the workforce. We call them generational anchoring benchmarks. But what's important to know is the problem is all caused by communication. If you think about why a project gets stopped, if you think about why someone isn't doing what you ask them to do as a team leader or as a team follower or a team member, why aren't people listening to you? That's where the work stops. So if we could just go to my little chart, and it's all taken from my book, Message Received. What I wanted to show you is what we look at, and we give everybody a name in the book, is we talk a little bit about how the digital listening, so how do you listen on technology, really affects how people interpret your message. And what we know from boomers, because they were trained in school very formally, they tend to be more formal when they work on and listen on digital. So that makes it very different for someone who grew up like Gen Z, as you can see right here, who grew up in technology and tends to abbreviate technology and tends to be very informal in their technology use. So you can begin to see the gap there. And that's really where we see the gap. Interestingly enough, most of the problems occur between Gen X and Gen Y, or millennials.
That's interesting.
And really, if we look at it, Ramit, from that point of view, it's easy to understand why. Gen X is the last generation in the workforce. Only about 6% of most workforces right now have boomers in them. But Gen X are the last people in the workforce that went to work and did not have a phone in their pocket. They started out on, personal computers of the time. That was the big fun thing. And so when they go to work, they still want to go to work. They still want to touch base with people. And so one of the problems that we're seeing, and I think that's a question right now with hybrid work, any suggestions to help is, yes, begin to look at some of these things. How in a hybrid workplace are you communicating with the people on your team? Are you communicating in a way that you want to communicate that's easy for you? Or are you communicating in a way that people want to listen and will hear when they're sitting at home in their living room? Or in my case today, in my basement. So when we want to look at these things, let's look at it. So when you want to capture someone's attention who's a boomer, remember when they're in school, write it in letter format. If you want to capture the attention of a Gen Xer, and we say 1960 to 1980 because we base our generations on how they use technology and how technology was introduced to them. So if I'm emailing you, Ramit, I probably would use a mix of short message and a to-do list, because you're probably a millennial on the cusp of Gen X. So you probably grew up around a lot of Gen X and had a lot of Gen X friends, but you're still a millennial in birth years. So I'll make sure that I make it very clear, very short, very clean. And I'll do that for all the team members. If I've got a lot of young team members, I'll make it very short, like a meme, because they're working at home, they're doing 14 different things, and then they have to focus. And when they focus, they tend to need pictures, which is one of the reasons I'm using a picture now. And then make sure you understand the wording to engage your entire team. So what we know about millennials and Gen Z is they're very they're very kinesthetic and visual. Why is that? Because they grew up online. Feel free to jump in. I could talk about this forever.
I love this. I am taking so much in, and it's kind of like, oh, that's why I do that. Or yes, I'm more receptive when I get an email or a message that's framed in a certain way. I do want to pick up on one thing, because we are talking about how important communication is and the different communication styles and how we should be communicating. But as organizations, how can you encourage better communication? If that's like the key to everything and why projects might stop, how can an organization encourage better communication?
One of the things that we have to do, and I have another chart if anybody wants to see it, is to begin to understand our new body language, our new digitally, when we're working at home. COVID changed everything. And that's one of the problems today. We totally think that we're going to work the same, but work is nowhere near the same than what it was when we were, pre-COVID. And I want people to begin to understand your brain. Your brain didn't have to deal with digital body language, is what we're doing right now, which is totally reversed to what it is when we're in person. So we're already, that's a stress point in your brain. So when I'm thinking of something, my eyes go up and to the right, and that's how I remember them, because I'm a visual learner. But kinesthetic learner would probably put their head down. Technically, when we put our heads down and we're thinking and we're kinesthetic learning, all of a sudden people go, oh, great, they're on their phone. Lovely, they're not listening to me. Problem, another stress point. So digital body language is causing stress points. And then when people have multiple screens and they're not looking at their screen and they're not talking to you, so I put my glasses on so I can see you, can see the screen in a certain way. Well, when I'm looking this way at another screen that's here, you're like, really? How come you're not paying attention to me? Stress point in communication. So what I advise people to do, and I have another screen that I'd love to share. I'm just going to just put it up, and then I'll try it again and make sure that I can share something with you. It's a little more difficult sometimes when I'm doing it this way, but I'm going to share this, and then I'm going to ask your team if they could give it a try and see if they can share what's next, is this idea of digital body language. And you can get all these charts in the book. If any of your people need a PDF, I'm happy to put it in a PDF. Just give it, just give us credit for our work. But what I think you should do is just put together fun, different games. Like we advise people to play generational trivia and put these charts into questions so people can begin to learn the different body language styles. And that's one of the things that people have to start looking at. We have changed how we work, but we don't change how we communicate. And that's what we need to do.
Can I build on that? Because the game of, let's say we're doing generational trivia or whatever it might be, what role do stereotypes and age-related discrimination play in creating tensions in a multi-generational workforce?
There are a lot of stereotypes, and I spent a lot of time in the book running them. And we probably don't need this chart for this, but you can see each generation has its own chart. What that's representing is each generation's generational anchoring benchmarks, which are political, which are parenting, which are the environment, which are schools. It means what in your mammalian brain anchored you to learn, what gave you that gut feeling. And so what we begin to see is millennials are probably the most adaptable and charming generation we have ever had. And yet people get bitter about that. And people get bitter about a lot of things when they look at each generation, because each generation has a different way of working. When Gen X grew up and went into the workforce, they were the first generation ever to go to work in a recession. So they were the last hired and the first fired. They were the first generation to experience layoffs. That had never happened before. And so what we begin to understand is, oh, so when they go to work, they put their head down, they take on every job they can. Money is the biggest thing to them. Where millennials grew up in a much less stressful environment. And millennials also had moms that worked. And so what we're seeing is an emerging trend with young millennial men that are 40, is they have absolutely no problem with women in power. It's an everyday thing for them. So again, this is where these stereotypes begin to emerge. Gen X, some of the older Gen X boomers were at school when there was a male university and a female university, and more men went to school. So again, looking at the stress points and understanding how your brain is processing this adds to ageism. Does that help?
That really does help. And our research comes out on February 26th. And I cannot tell you the number of times stereotypes and assumptions and the stories that women have shared with their experience in the workplace, like so much of that and so much of what you're sharing, it comes up, especially as it relates to stereotypes. Okay, I've got 2 more questions, and then we are going to go into our chat function. So if you do have any questions about communication across multi-generational workforces, please pop them into the chat function. My next question is this: in your experience, what challenges do you often encounter when working with colleagues from different generations?
Now, why don't I tell you a story? Because I think that will help you identify where I'm coming from. I work with a lot of very, very large corporations, and this corporation's name will not, it doesn't matter. Just understand it's a Fortune 100 company, Fortune 10 company, actually. So one day I get an email from a manager who says, I don't understand what's going on. I've asked this person to do something 7 times. I've gone to HR. We're going to have to start the process of coaching, which means you get 1 letter, and if you don't turn it around, you're gone. And so coaching means HR helps you. And conversely, the person he was talking about didn't understand what was going on, didn't understand the problem. And let me explain it. It was an MBA graduate. And in their first culture, in the culture that they were brought up to in work. And if you think about this, this is how all millennials were taught in school, which is you socialize your answer, which means you take time, you think about it, and then you respond. That's what happens when you socialize an idea as a team, because millennials were taught in school to participate as team members, ask opinions of other people. You don't just go on the cuff, where Gen Xers and boomers were taught on the cuff because they were taught on rote. The problem was with the Gen X manager. He had an issue with the fact that this person was taking too long to respond and too long to give information back to the manager. But when we asked the manager, was the work great? He said, never seen anything better. It's just taking too long. Where the millennial was saying, I don't understand this person's need for speed. The project isn't due for 3 months, and what we're doing is gathering data to make a support. So it just had to begin to share how 2 different people. And so what the team had to do was manage expectations. If I send you an email, I expect an answer by 24 hours later. And that actually became a rule that they put into their onboarding. So what you have to begin to understand is, what is the root of the communications issue? And then how can you solve it? And then share it with other people, because in this case, the majority of other people were having that problem too. Does that help?
It does. And it sounds like it's that miscommunication, but also managing expectations, right? Managing each other's expectations. But in order to do that, you need to communicate and communicate effectively. And if you don't know what the other person's intention is, sometimes we assume the worst, and that's not the case at all. So thank you for sharing that anecdote. My last question is this: as technology and digitization become increasingly prevalent in our lives, how can organizations make sure all generations feel comfortable and empowered to contribute effectively?
Create a communications handbook when you're onboarding and create games. What we have to understand, and someone has just said, how do you support the individual as a combination of two learning styles? So I'm going to get to that. And I'm going to play a little game with you, Remy, if you don't mind, to help people begin to understand this, to learn dominant learning styles. But I'd like to go back to creating a communications binder. What you need to begin to look at is how your team's communicating. When is their top time for communication and collaboration? And then put it all in a book that's easy, or a PowerPoint or something fun that says, hey, let's create a little handbook on digital, because none of our brains are used to this. Our brains are the most amazing creatures on the face of the planet. But for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we communicated face to face, and we communicated in writing. And now we're going back to caveman time, where we communicate in short pictures. And so our brain has to adjust. And as marvelous as it is, you know, it took thousands of years for it to grow from ounces to pounds. We have to give it some time, and we have to give it workouts. So each week in your management meetings, find a different fun tool for communicating or how someone communicates. For example, use what I just showed you for boomers and Gen X, and the differences in how they were educated and how they use technology. Another thing to do is to play games or to do a fun test. So I'm going to do a test with you. And if you don't mind, and this is just something I designed for fun. Anyone is welcome to do it. I actually have a game you can download, or if someone needs it, I will send it to you. Remy, just send me an email and I'll flip the PowerPoints to you. It's called the VAC game.
Okay.
And what I found is most managers didn't know how to enter into this topic of learning styles on technology. So the first thing to do is ask a series of fun questions. I do this, but I have much more formal questions that managers can do. Because we're friends, it's easy to do. So I would like you to relax.
Okay, I'm ready.
Put your bottom on your chair and shift. Shift a little.
Okay.
Shift a little. Sink into your bottom. Awesome. And just hands down, head down. Fantastic. Now look at me. I want you to think of your bedroom when you were 5. I want you to think of the color of your walls. I want you to think of a pink elephant in the left corner of your wall, and then hear your mom's voice as you're thinking of this. How did you feel when you heard your mom's voice? Awesome.
Okay.
So what I just learned from that, and what all of our wonderful watchers of this great program probably saw, was rarely did your eyes go up and to the right. You're a very auditory person. You love to talk. So I know when I'm communicating with you that your learning style is auditory. I will recommend auditory books for you. I will recommend podcasts for you. I will record a meeting that you're not at and just send you the auditory. For example, Otter would be perfect for you. It's a technology that we use a lot. For visual people, they'd like a PowerPoint. For visual kinesthetic people, they'd like the PowerPoint and the auditory. So these are some of the things that I want people to begin to understand, is how people are doing it. When people have 2 different learning styles, there's typically a dominant learning style. Yeah. But what you do is find technology that serves both. For you, I would find a technology that serves auditory and visual. So as I just said, that could be Otter. That could be a recording like this. It could be an Audible book that allows you, when you want, to download the descriptions or the charts within it.
So, Mary, what I'm hearing you say is when the people watching are going to go back, they're going to create a communications binder. And I visually thought of that as an actual binder because I
Yeah,
remember onboarding years ago using a big binder and flipping through it and reading everything. So, there's the physical binder, there's the digital version, and now we need to also create a version where it's just audio for those who prefer to learn that way.
right. And so just begin to think of it that way. Go back to thinking everyone is in primary school and how are
Mhm.
you best going to help them learn? You want to build trust with your team. So when you're creating that binder, I encourage you to play fun and silly games about understanding communication preferences with each generation, even 3 minutes in your staff and team meetings. Another thing to do is every Friday, write down something you learned that's new and something the team did really well in communication. I pull this from the past CEO of Kaiser Permanente, a big healthcare service provider in the United States. I had a great opportunity of working with him and he mentored me. And what he did every Friday was he sent a note to everybody that said, here are our wins, here are our losses, and here's where we're going next week. Do the exact same thing with communication, because if you think about communication as the bedrock of everything you're doing with your team, you can have a number of wins and losses. You know, just like the football game yesterday, lots of people won and lots of people lost, but you know, lots of people made money.
The game was a lot of fun to watch. I want to get to, thank you so much, Mary, for that. I want to get to some audience questions. Why don't we build on the one that you had seen and you were starting to talk about? Let's get into that one. How best can you support the individual who has a combination of at least two learning styles? And then we'll get to the next one.
For you, I think in those charts I was showing earlier, what I was talking about is words to use, words to type. So if someone is a visual and kinesthetic person, use visual words and kinesthetic words. So do you see what I'm saying? How does that make you feel? You notice I did that a couple of statements ago when I said, how did that help you? Did I answer your question? It was much more of an auditory statement directed at you to ensure that I met your needs because you're an auditory learner. If you were a visual learner, I said, did that help you picture what I was saying? So with a person who has visual and kinesthetic learning, which a lot of millennials do, by the way, you want to make sure you just use a mix of those words. Don't use words like here. Don't use words like, my opinion. You want to be much more inclusive in your language.
And so I find that to be fascinating because a big thing that I just pulled out of that is the way that I'm communicating meeting your needs
Right.
versus the way I'm communicating meeting my needs, and the way I'm used to communicating is the way that I'm communicating meeting your needs. And I think that's a powerful point. So thank you. I'm going to go on to the next question. What are some of the multi-generational challenges with hybrid work? Any suggestions to help with motivation in a hybrid work environment across generations? Great question.
Yes. Again, we're going to go back to understanding everyone's differences. Probably the best thing I've ever seen that I really started to see in our work with Microsoft was the adaptation of the workday. So a lot of people might get up and want to get into work super early, and other people who are taking kids to school and are working from home, that's a really difficult time for them. How do you adapt that? Well, start looking at different versions or different times of team meetings. And quite often you can do something very interesting with your team meetings, which is figure out a different time. For example, 1:10 to 1:25. It sounds like a little thing, but it's respectful. So what you do is you pick 3 times and then you say which of these times works for the majority of the team. And you take the top 2 and you can rotate your times. And then what you also start looking at doing is understanding which language your team is using most in each area. So if you look on Teams, you yourself as a leader or as someone who wants to move ahead in the organization, think of this as how to win friends and influence people, can see the types of words that your team uses most. Do they use visual words, auditory words, kinesthetic words? And then look at what words you use and close that gap. because there's always a gap. It doesn't matter what happens. And last but not least, if you're looking at a multi-generational workforce, always go down to the youngest denominator, because everybody else understands. So what I would recommend is every time you need to have a meeting, make sure that you use a calendar invite, you give a link, and you share the information and ask for any questions.
Love it. Thank you. I've got one last question. We have time for one more question. How can you communicate in all these styles across a large organization? And Mary, I know you've worked with multiple large organizations. That's difficult to do. So how do we communicate in all these styles?
What you do, as what I was just talking about, is taking it down to its simplest form.
Okay.
Ensure that you are very clearly saying, what do I need? When do I need it? How do I get it? What questions might arise, and what might stop us from reaching this goal? Mm-hmm. And the language you use neutral language. Don't use visual, auditory, kinesthetic language. Use just very, very neutral language. And again, I gave you some ideas of that in the charts. And it's hard to learn, but once you learn it, you'll notice your productivity goes up at least 32%.
I love that. And it's requiring us to be more intentional. And that's what I'm hearing. We have to be intentional about the way that we communicate. It is essential. And as you've said, it is the bedrock. Thank you so much, Dr. Mary Donahue. We appreciate you. If you don't follow Dr. Donahue, I encourage you to do so. Check out her website. Again, you can find her books on Amazon. We appreciate your charts. I love a good chart, as you already know, and your insights as it relates to communicating across multi-generational workforces. To everyone joining today, I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We are back next month, and we're going to be focusing on ageism in the workplace. And we hope everyone has a wonderful start to their week. Dr. Mary Donahue, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure, and it's always wonderful to see you. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Be well.